So here we go. So what am I going to touch on? There is something really important happening, and it's not everybody seems to be aware of it, and it's being driven by the new European Green Deal and the new economics that are kind of running through the world at the moment, but Europe are way in front. So I'm going to touch on the European Green Deal, open source technology, how it fits, and digital infrastructures, decarbonisation and dematerialisation. Now, this chap, John Maynard Keynes, said practical men, and I've added in the data centre industry, who believe themselves to be quite exempt from an intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Now, what I'm going to show you now is the 21st century embedded economy model. Now, the 21st century embedded economy model is really what is behind the European Green Deal. Now, this is a kind of a picture of it here, and you can see that everything is embedded in the earth. That's why they use the term embedded. And the economy sits in the middle, society next, and then the earth. You can see the inputs on the left, like solar energy, heat output. But notice in the middle here, you've got the commons. Now, what this is the open source technology collaborative commons. Now, the Green Deal was being pushed big time by the EU, and you're going to see some very interesting things coming through in legislation that are going to move the industry towards decarbonisation and also towards open source technologies. You're going to see climate laws coming through. Now, there's one I've just highlighted here, and it's the EU border tax on embedded CO2. Now, you may not be aware of what scope 3 is, this embodied CO2, but it's going to be the big thing that's going to come through in the next few years in the EU. The argument won't be about energy, it'll be about embodied CO2. Another thing that the Europeans are doing, there's a European sponsored project looking at open source technology, software and hardware, and the impact it can have on the competitiveness and innovation in the EU economy. This, again, is the evidence base for future policies within the European Union. Some countries have already adopted open source technologies and are rolling them out now, but this will be coming from the EU Commission as a directive. This is a very interesting video you can look at. It's in German, watch it afterwards. Now, open source got good enough in 2019. You may not be aware of some of the big deals that happened in 2019, but I'm talking about deals well over 100 billion in business transactions. And there on the right, you can see SUSE, big German software company, and also SAP. But look down there on the bottom left, IBM purchasing an open source software company for 34 billion. It's quite amazing what's happened just last year. When we look back in time, 2019 will look like the year when open source really got good enough. Now, it's happening also in the car industry, and I thought that you guys might like to know about this. You can see here Tesla has open sourced all its patents. So the German car manufacturing industry now moving quickly into open source technologies for their electric vehicles. You can see numerous things about this on the car industry websites. This bottom right hand one is a really good embedded video which you can look at, and it shows all of the open source technology that sits inside a new BMW electric vehicle. Whoops. Didn't mean to do that.
Here's how to find all the open source.
So, a few pointers. Open source hardware support. It's very, very simple. 99% reduction in server hardware support technicians in data centers. Open source dematerialization. When you apply open source technologies into a data center, you'll see a 90% less hardware. We call it dematerialization in a data center. Now, in this slide deck, you will see in the notes references to videos, and this is based on a CommScope presentation where they show before and after pictures, and you see this 10 racks going down to 1. Open source decarbonisation, 80% lower CO2 emissions from the data centre. Big stories, few people are aware though, unless you're in the community. Lower capex figures. You can now build open source optimised data centres at 75% lower capex than traditional tier 3s. Now you're going to hear from Tor later, but probably the most efficient air-cooled data centre in the world is up in Sweden. And after me, you'll hear Tor talking about this. Now they've achieved a PUE better than 1.02. Infinitely better than proprietary hardware when you start looking at circular economy. Infinitely better. None of this lock-in. And next year you'll be seeing open source firmware on servers as a must-have. So for a server to be truly defined as open source, it must be running open source firmware. And this is a quote from Larry Ellison. Now, Larry Ellison, as you all know, was the guy who started Oracle. And I do like this quote. Once open source gets good enough, competing with it will be insane. And I do believe that when we look back in history, we'll find the tipping point on open source technologies occurred last year in 2019. So that's me. Questions?
Okay, super. John, thank you very much. I'm just gonna close your presentation. Thanks a lot. And you said it before, and we talked about this yesterday. The video that is implemented in your PowerPoint presentation is really worth seeing, right? So after our participants get your slides, they should take a few minutes and look at it, right? You said it's really worth seeing. So please, participants, you can do that after you receive them. Ulrike, do you have any questions at this moment?
Yes, first of all, a very simple question. What do you mean by hardware?
Well, initially when it started, this foundation, the Open Compute Project, started in 2011. It was started by the consumers of hardware of data centers, Facebook, Microsoft, Goldman Sachs. And initially they started looking just at the server, but now it includes open source servers, open source storage, open source switches, open source data centers, and not just big data centers, the big hyperscale, but modular data centers. If you want to build your own modular data center, you could go onto the OCP website, download the specification and build your own modular data center if you wish. So it's basically, it seems to be broadening into including just about anything to do with a data center, not just the software.
Mm-hmm. So one thing in open source software is the question how big is and lively is the community. So I would ask how lively is the community of Open Compute Project?
6,000 voluntary engineers.
And as you mentioned, it started with the big players, Facebook and later on LinkedIn, today Microsoft. So would you say it's also ready to be implemented in smaller data centers, like we heard before, with 30 or less racks?
Oh yes, definitely. There's such a big story here that I don't have time, but if you just go away and look at this, it's called Open Called, C-O-R-D. And what it is, it's all of the world's telecommunication service providers are converting their telephone exchanges into open source. And a typical telephone exchange might only have about 2 racks. So it's a data center using open source with 2 racks. Okay, there might be 100,000 data centers, all the telephone exchanges. And to give you an idea on the scale of it, in the next 8 years, it's a $1 trillion transformation project on hardware.
All right. We have a question from the community. It's hard to enforce the GPL. Do you know where to get help to fight the GPL?
Right, if you want to talk legal, then I would recommend you go and talk to a lawyer. I stay clear of these. Now, one thing that you've got to be aware of is when you kind of work within these communities, you don't have to give up your intellectual property. The licenses that we use basically is to stop people suing each other. So people can feel safe when they work in the community and they can collaborate. So at the moment, there's a fantastic collaboration using these new GPUs called the Open Accelerator Project. And they've now agreed on a common motherboard, so with a common socket. Now, because all these manufacturers have come together, they don't want to be kind of having the lawyers on their backs later. So the legal side that we ask for is just that you don't sue each other, you collaborate, you come up with a common, say, motherboard, and then it maximizes the efficiency and speed of the manufacturer, and it massively reduces their development cost.
Yeah. All right.
And it's just about, really, it's about being human. Don't get the lawyers too involved because they will make life difficult for you.
Yeah. Okay. And John, and then maybe do you have kind of open source first steps for the German data center community?
Well, the first step is that you have to, inside this head here, you've got this kind of fixed way of doing things. And you've got to change it. And if you don't, you will not compete with what's going on. All these apps that we're using now are running on this open source tech. You might hear the term cloud native. Cloud native really means open source infrastructures. But people don't seem to get their head around well, what's going on. And it is something that's a problem with us because we don't really tell people outside the community.
Yeah.
We're terrible. We don't have a marketing budget.
That's good. All right. So I think we answered all the questions that I saw, at least. Thank you for participating. Thank you for asking. Yeah, thank you very much, John, for being part of it, sharing your thoughts. Thank you also that we can distribute your presentation afterwards, including the video. And yeah, thank you for being part of it. Hopefully we see us soon, and next year you will be maybe also at Data Center Day, the live event.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I turned off my animated background, I would have a British electrical socket on the wall behind me so that there's proof that I'm in England. Okay.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. And just go and, it's all on the internet, everything you want. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your awareness. Bye-bye.